Pentagon just asked Japan and Australia to clarify their wartime role if China moves on Taiwan, and Israel's strikes on Iran have triggered a call for nuclear talks, but only if no more attacks happen. Meanwhile, German intel warns Russia may soon test NATO's resolve with hybrid tactics. This isn't regional news. It's multi-front geopolitics in motion. In the next few minutes, you'll see how three separate crises, from East Asia to the Middle East to Eastern Europe, are converging on one critical test. Can the West keep its cohesion when every front demands full attention? The Pentagon's sudden push for clarity from Japan and Australia on Taiwan defense obligations shocked many, but for those paying close attention, it was only a matter of time. For decades, the U.S. maintained a stance of strategic ambiguity when it came to Taiwan, a calculated vagueness that allowed for deterrence without direct commitment. But ambiguity doesn't hold when the chessboard starts to shake. Japan, bound by a post-war constitution that limits military engagement strictly to self-defense, has always walked a tightrope. Australia, though a loyal ally, has historically deferred to Washington's lead without issuing clear public doctrine on what would trigger its involvement. Now, that quiet cooperation isn't enough. The Pentagon isn't asking for verbal reassurances or vague diplomatic platitudes. They want written commitments, operational frameworks, and defined rules of engagement. In plain terms, they're asking, if China moves, will you fight? The timing isn't random. Over the past 6 months, China's military posture around Taiwan has shifted from symbolic to rehearsed. Live-fire naval exercises, bomber flyovers, joint amphibious landing drills. This isn't training for show, it's rehearsal for execution. U.S. Indo-Pacific Command is now operating under the assumption that a Taiwan invasion is not if, but when. And that when could come during a moment of Western distraction or economic weakness. The 2027 timeline, tied to the People's Liberation Army's modernization goals, is fast becoming the consensus target window. And if Beijing decides to strike, America won't have the luxury of building a coalition after the fact. The response has to be instant, unified, and overwhelming. That only happens if Japan and Australia are already locked in and ready. What's at stake is more than Taiwan. If either Japan or Australia hesitate, if they waver even briefly, Beijing may interpret it as a green light. A fractured Allied front means China could split focus, seize ground, and force a negotiated ceasefire before the West can fully mobilize. This isn't hypothetical. Japan hosts key U.S. air bases, naval hubs, and logistical infrastructure that would be essential in any Pacific war. Australia provides critical intelligence coordination, fuel reserves, and strategic geography for long-range operations. Without their active participation, U.S. response time slows, regional coordination suffers, and deterrence fails. So when the Pentagon makes that call and asks for ink on paper, it's not about politics, it's about making sure the first 72 hours of a war don't become the last. This brings up a key strategic dilemma deep inside Washington's war rooms and briefing halls, one that's no longer theoretical but playing out in real time. Should the United States double down on pushing Europe and Pacific allies simultaneously, or is it time to prioritize, consolidate, and focus resources on one region at a time? It's a classic two-front tension with 21st century consequences. On one side are defense hawks like former Undersecretary Elbridge Colby, who argue that China isn't just the pacing threat, it's the pacing crisis. From his perspective, the U.S. must accelerate its entire Indo-Pacific strategy by nearly a decade. That means sharpening intelligence collection to anticipate China's moves with surgical precision, reconfiguring force posture to allow for rapid joint deployment from Guam to Okinawa, and hardwiring command structures so that Australia, Japan, and U.S. forces don't just cooperate, they operate as one. Colby and those in his camp believe that the longer America tries to balance both theaters, the more it risks failing in both. In this view, Europe is important, but China is decisive. They argue that without a dominant presence in the Pacific, the U.S.-led world order crumbles and a new multipolar reality, shaped by Beijing and Moscow, will emerge by default. But this aggressive pivot faces stiff resistance, not just from cautious voices in the Pentagon, but from lawmakers on Capitol Hill and diplomatic allies across NATO. Their concern isn't just about perception, it's about capability. If Washington pivots too sharply to the Pacific, Europe could be left exposed. Ukraine's resistance has been sustained in large part due to consistent U.S. military and economic aid. Pull that too fast, and you not only risk a collapse on the Eastern Front, you signal to allies everywhere that American commitment has an expiration date. This isn't an academic debate. This is a live, classified, high-stakes argument shaping where troops get stationed, where dollars get spent, and how deterrence is defined in the modern era. Strategic crossroads like this define empires, whether they rise, recalibrate, or overextend and break. In a world where Russia tightens its grip in the West and China builds momentum in the East, every misstep in prioritization can have irreversible consequences. And that's what makes this moment so critical, not just for defense planners, but for the future shape of global stability. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, tensions flared with new urgency as Israel executed a calculated and high-impact series of strikes on Iran's Natanz and Fordow nuclear facilities, two sites that have long been the nerve centers of Iran's uranium enrichment program. In a move coordinated closely, though unofficially, with U.S. regional operations, American forces reportedly launched salvos near Isfahan just days prior. The strikes were precise, aimed not only at disrupting the enrichment cycle, but at sending a message. Nuclear latency is no longer tolerated. Iran confirmed structural damage and equipment losses, but carefully downplayed the scale, acknowledging setbacks without admitting any loss of nuclear material. And that nuance matters. Because here's the brutal truth often buried in headlines. You can damage a centrifuge hall or collapse an underground tunnel, but unless you neutralize every trace of enriched uranium and render all associated military and scientific infrastructure inoperable, nuclear capability is not destroyed, it's delayed. Months, not years, are all that separate a damaged program from a restored one. Tehran's retaliation was swift. In a bold show of force, Iran launched medium-range ballistic missiles at Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, a critical node for U.S. Central Command operations. This was not just a symbolic move. It was a calibrated test of American interceptor capabilities against real-world threats. Reports indicate that some intercepts were successful, but the message from Tehran was clear. Escalation will not go unanswered. Yet, just hours later, Iran's foreign ministry hinted at a conditional willingness to re-engage in nuclear negotiations. The catch? Talks would only resume if Israel and the U.S. halt all kinetic actions. In other words, no more strikes. For Washington and Tel Aviv, that's a non-starter. The idea of de-escalating while leaving Iran's nuclear program intact, shielded from further scrutiny or sabotage, is politically and strategically unacceptable. What this moment illustrates is a hard truth about deterrence in the modern Middle East. Diplomacy only works when paired with credible threat. Tehran is maneuvering between victimhood and brinkmanship, trying to salvage leverage while warning against further action. But both the U.S. and Israel know that delay equals risk. Every day Iran's nuclear infrastructure is allowed to rebuild is a day closer to a breakout scenario. And as regional actors like Saudi Arabia and Turkey watch closely, the real danger isn't just what Iran does next, it's what nuclear ambiguity triggers in an already fragile region where red lines are constantly being tested. This standoff is a textbook example of modern deterrence dynamics, where every action is designed not just to respond, but to shape future decisions. Iran's message is unmistakable. Strike us again, and we'll escalate further. Missiles today, perhaps nuclear thresholds tomorrow, unless the West backs off. But that's precisely the catch. If the U.S. or Israel pause now, they risk signaling weakness not only to Tehran, but to a broader coalition of actors watching for any hesitation. The lesser-known variable in this equation is Russia. Multiple intelligence sources suggest that Moscow played a subtle yet pivotal role in the recent escalation, either by supplying satellite targeting data, sharing missile telemetry insights, or advising Iran's military planners behind closed doors. While not overt, these support mechanisms are enough to paint a larger picture, an emergent alliance structure unofficially dubbed the Axis of Resistance. This informal bloc, consisting of Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea, may not share a single command, but their behaviors are becoming increasingly synchronized. They share missile and drone technology, economic strategies to evade Western sanctions, and strategic messaging aimed at undermining NATO's cohesion and the US's global credibility. It's a network, not a pact, but the coordination is real. From the Persian Gulf, we shift north to the edges of NATO's eastern flank. In Berlin, the German Foreign Intelligence Service, the BND, issued an unusually blunt public statement. It warned of possible Russian attempts to test NATO's Article 5 commitment, not through traditional invasion, but through gray zone aggression, power grid sabotage, rail disruptions, cyber attacks on government systems, or inciting unrest via covert operatives. The goal would be to trigger just enough confusion and hesitation to make NATO's political mechanisms wobble. Russia's military doctrine, especially under Gerasimov's influence, views hybrid warfare as a legitimate way to weaken opponents without crossing conventional red lines. The idea isn't to crush NATO militarily, but to paralyze it politically. If NATO hesitates even once, the entire deterrence framework begins to erode. And Moscow knows that. Already forces in Lithuania and Poland have shifted posture. AWACS radar planes are circling near Kaliningrad, and Romania has doubled its NATO coordination briefings. These are not drills. These are quiet moves in preparation for a test Russia may already be staging. What binds these events together is simultaneity. We're not facing isolated crises, but a converging triangle of geopolitical flashpoints: Taiwan, Iran, and Eastern Europe. Each one demands attention, planning, and readiness. But together, they become a stress test for Western capacity. Think of it as a pressure cooker with 3 burners turned to high. If one explodes, the others accelerate. And that's exactly the strategy adversaries are banking on, not brute military victories, but creating a tempo of crisis the West can't sustain. Here's the reflection that few are articulating. What we're seeing is not just regional turbulence, it's time coordination. China doesn't test its navy randomly. It calibrates drills around U.S. carrier group movements. Iran launches missiles when U.S. air defense rotations are lightest. Russia shifts posture when Europe is politically distracted or economically vulnerable. This is escalation by rhythm, warfare not of territory, but of bandwidth. If Western leadership continues treating these as siloed threats, Asia on Tuesday, the Middle East on Thursday, they'll fail to see when threads become a net. Adversaries understand the power of timing. They're not racing to the finish, they're probing for the weak link. And the deeper truth is this: in modern conflict, perception is momentum. Once it appears the West is stretched too thin or politically fractured, the window opens. That's when real decisions get made. Not just in capitals like Moscow or Beijing, but in places like Vilnius, Taipei, and Doha. Places that are quiet now, but may not be for long. This isn't a future risk, it's a present reality. Few decisions are local anymore. If you made it all the way here, you're not just scrolling, you're tracking today's battlegrounds of global power. Subscribe to Safety Zone. Don't let headlines frame your worldview. Follow the real strategy in motion.